The Team Ico games have been celebrated as some of the greatest pieces of art in the video game format. Fumito Ueda has contributed so much with so little when it came to his approach with video game design, and he and his team have accomplished so much when it comes to progressing the art of video game narratives. One of the most intriguing aspects of his narratives is the implication that all of his games have a shared universe. This has been very much implied ever since Shadow of the Colossus was announced as a spiritual successor, and the ending of Shadow of the Colossus indicated that the events of that game preceded the events of Ico. So in order to go further, I'm going to have to go into spoiler territory with all the games that I'm going to be talking about. Ico, Shadow of the Colossus, and The Last Guardian, at least as of recording this. I'm aware that Fumito Ueda is at work making a new game with a theme of robot, but until that game releases, this is the full extent of the timeline that we can speculate on. Although, with the initial teaser that we've got, I've got a few speculations on my own that I'll contribute. I'll also acknowledge some possible faults with this theory of mine if and whenever necessary, but given the context of what we have and how the beauty of these games is that it leaves a lot up to audience interpretation without talking down to their intelligence, I think this topic is certainly worth talking about. So, before we get started, I should indicate the order of games that were released. Ico was the first game that Team Ico made, then they made Shadow of the Colossus, then they made The Last Guardian, and they are currently working on that robot game. I propose that these games share a chronological timeline which goes as follows. Shadow of the Colossus first, then Ico, then The Last Guardian, and then this robot game up and coming. Now, I could be wrong on what I'm going to mention, I will say that, but just through intuition and inquiry in regards to how technology is developed in this timeline and how certain events play out, I think this timeline makes the most sense, also on a thematic basis, which I'll get into later. So, in Shadow of the Colossus, the implication is that that story is set in an ancient time, about a boy who was trying to bring someone close to him back to life, and he traveled to a long abandoned land in order to get that sorted. The land that he travels, the Forbidden Land, is so ancient that the very areas he's traveling on are very much reminiscent of ancient civilizations in today's world. As a matter of fact, it's heavily implicated with the fact that the dark deity that Wander, the young boy, talks to is called Dormin. As many of you know already, Dormin is Nimrod spelled backwards, and Nimrod is in reference to a figure from the Old Testament of the same name who was heavily affiliated with the construction of the Tower of Babel, a tower that was meant to stretch to the heavens and showcase the pride of man, only for that to backfire and God punished the people with division of languages. Something thematically similar occurs in the events of Shadow of the Colossus, or more specifically, prior to the events of Shadow of the Colossus, in the fact that, spoiler alert, Dormin turns out to be a dark entity and that the fragments of himself were scattered after he spread so much tyranny throughout the lands. The spreading of his essence, the fact that Dormin was spread out in such a manner is very much reminiscent of how the people of the Tower of Babylon were spread out by the division of languages. Something else I should note is that throughout the series, you'll notice a constant theme of supernatural light versus the supernatural dark. This is very reminiscent of many different religions worldwide. One of the more widely speculated religions that this series of games takes inspiration from is the yin and yang of Taoism, this sense of light and darkness bringing balance into the world. The narrative structures of the games are also very much reminiscent of being in harmony with nature, as the narrative structures of these games also echo similar virtues and lessons taught in the religions of Shintoism, Buddhism, and Christianity. Side note, the reason why I'm going out of my way to mention religious symbolism in this series is that it could play an integral role in the sense of historicity in this timeline. Wander is an individual who failed to harmonize with nature. In an attempt to try to bring back his loved one, he tried to do so using a corrupt means, killing other innocent beings to resurrect one. And his punishment was that he lost everything, including practically his own life, to the point where, out of an act of divine mercy, the shaman threw the ancient sword of light into the pool, sucking Wander in, transforming him into a baby with horns. This can be said to be representative of being born again, to have a second chance to start again from scratch. What is most notable here is that Wander has horns, and it has been speculated that Wander is the first of a whole bloodline of horned people. Later on in Eco, people having horns on their heads are seen as a dark omen, and so people with horns on their head are sent to an ancient castle, which has been long abandoned, and sacrifice the children with horns to the dark forces of the queen who lives there. Now, fans speculate that the maiden, Mono, that Wander was dedicating his whole campaign to trying to resurrect, fans speculate that Mono is the queen that appears in Eco. I can certainly see where they get that from, but given their contrasting natures, I highly doubt it. I acknowledge that people can change over time, but I doubt that's the case, because you have to take into consideration we don't know how long people can live under what conditions in this kind of world. The evidence for Mono being the evil queen that appears in the Eco game is speculative at best. There's nothing concrete to justify that, but then again, a lot of the evidence to combine these games together is also non-concrete, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Now, how did Wander get the Bloodline started, given how the bridge collapsed at the end of the game? The only bridge that was said to be the only means to enter the Forbidden Lands. It's not the only way in. You'll notice that if you explore the area of the Forbidden Lands, there's also a boat by a beach. Even if that boat wasn't there, if Wander wanted to leave, he could easily craft a boat for himself, using any trees he could find, just make a boat from scratch. Either that, or he could, when he grew up, climbed up the big wall where the bridge used to be. Either way, I speculate, and fans speculate on this as well, that when Mono was taking care of the baby Wander, and it was time for Wander to leave, and presumably Mono was aging perhaps, or maybe not, who knows. Wander then comes of age where he wants to leave, so whether by boat or by climbing the wall, he then meets and falls in love with somebody else, and they start the bloodline of horned people, thus kickstarting the events of Eco. As for the origins of the Queen, I speculate that this was a royal family that was separate from Mono, and that they were in power for quite a significant amount of time. If you look around the environments of Eco, you'll notice there's a lot of these train carts, these different railways, these different windmills and all kinds of devices, platforms and chains and stuff like that. The technology for the Eco game is more akin to something medieval, so it's definitely more advanced than what resembles technology in the Forbidden Land from Shadow of the Colossus.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, when it comes to because I have seen elements of games introducing elements of medieval and that, but also have elements of the Victorian period and that when it comes to technology. Such as trams and trains and stuff. Whee!
I mean, the thing about fantasy is that it's not just restricted to the medieval period. A fantasy is basically whatever it is you want it to be.
I suppose.
I think the fans and I can agree on that much. I should note the technology here because later on down the line, The Last Guardian is said to have technology that's far more advanced than what we've seen in the previous games, especially with the use of glowing technology, these knights that can come to life, as well as the Master of the Valley, which is implied to be some kind of advanced AI system, which is probably conscious and has a malicious means of some kind. And then, of course, later on down the line, there's going to be that robot game, which is implied to be set in some kind of post-apocalyptic setting because there's that common theme of ruined civilizations. Side note, I should note that Fumito Ueda himself says that he neither loves nor hates the ruined environments. It's just something that he observes and wonders about, and he translates that sense of wonder into these games.
Now, Fumito Ueda did intend each of his games to stand out individually, and yet when he was asked directly whether Shadow of the Colossus is a prequel to Eco, Ueda himself replied, and I'm paraphrasing here, that yes, gamers have thought that Shadow of the Colossus is a prequel to Eco, and he likes the idea as well. So it's safe to say, we have confirmation that Shadow of the Colossus is a prequel to Eco. Now, many online fans, like the much-respected Max Derrat, have speculated that The Last Guardian is a prequel to the Shadow of the Colossus game, and the upcoming genATLAS, which has finally had a recent trailer released, is also a prequel to The Last Guardian. Now, Max Derrat is a YouTuber I deeply respect when it comes to analyzing artistic integrity in video games, and he's spent a lot of time analyzing Fumito Ueda's games. With much respect to Max Derrat, I sincerely doubt his theory of the timeline of these games going backwards with each installment. The reason why I doubt this is because of my speculation on the progress of technology within Ueda's games. I know all of this is theoretical anyway, but just through observational detail, common sense would lead me to believe that the technology would develop as follows. We start off with the ancient times of Shadow of the Colossus. Then we see technology develop a little bit more with train tracks and chandeliers in Eco. Then we see that develop a bit more to the point where we have more sophisticated technology in The Last Guardian, and then that sophisticated technology becomes even more complex by the time we get to genATLAS. Now, it is a rather cool idea to have genATLAS establish vast landscapes worth of abandoned robots akin to Laputa Castle in the Sky and whatnot, and to have a dramatic landscape of post-apocalyptic tech just dominate the landscape. It would be a pretty cool idea to have that be in the ancient past, something akin to Sonic Frontiers. But my doubt with this theory is that if this were true, we would be seeing a lot of metallic work within the landscape of Shadow of the Colossus. Of course, people could just easily speculate that the metallic surfaces are seen elsewhere, and others would say that the robots and whatnot have long decayed by the time of Shadow of the Colossus. But the stonework has managed to survive this long, despite being covered in moss all throughout the Shadow of the Colossus game. So, what would give all the metallic work in genATLAS the excuse? With that said, upon further inspection, steel structures and aluminium are prone to corrosion and collapse, so I can understand that within thousands of years, such stuff would eventually dissipate. But even then, if, according to what we've seen with genATLAS so far, if the landscape of advanced technology is this vast, then surely a civilization covering entire landscapes with metallic structures and flooring would likely leave enormous traces, which places a lot of doubt on the structure of Shadow of the Colossus. The design structure of the buildings within Shadow of the Colossus are entirely different from the ones we've seen in genATLAS. The design structure of the buildings we've seen in genATLAS so far reflect a kind of cold industrial approach. The same cannot be said for the building design of Shadow of the Colossus. I mean no disrespect to Max Derrat. I could very well be wrong in my speculation. With that said, I'd be curious to hear his insight on what I have to say if he somehow watches this video.
So that's my speculation on the exact order of which game goes which. I know there's a lot of people who say that The Last Guardian happened before Shadow of the Colossus, and I acknowledge the fact that when Bluepoint Games made their remake of Shadow of the Colossus, much respect to Bluepoint Games, if you look carefully around the environments, there is a barrel containing the blue life essence that's used to feed Trico. However, in that same remake, and to my knowledge, I think this Easter egg also appeared in the original version of Shadow of the Colossus, you'll also find melons on a beach nearby, which is a reference to the ending of Eco, more specifically the bonus ending for Eco. Now, I doubt that this is conclusive evidence that this means that Eco and The Last Guardian were set before the Shadow of the Colossus. It's more likely that they were placed there just as fun Easter eggs for fans to notice, rather than something that implies something in regards to the lore. With that said, come to think of it, maybe, it may very well be that these Easter eggs aren't just fun Easter eggs. Maybe, just maybe, the past events of Shadow of the Colossus existed, and then we got the events of Eco, and then we got the events of The Last Guardian, and then we got the present timeline of Shadow of the Colossus, and then we get the robot game. That could very well be the case if these Easter eggs are in fact canon. But until we see more conclusive evidence to imply otherwise, then these Easter eggs are just fun Easter eggs and nothing more. For now at least, I stand by my theory that the chronology goes as follows. Shadow of the Colossus, then Eco, then The Last Guardian, then the robot, and my primary piece of evidence to back this up is the observable development of technology through this chronological timeline. We see very primitive torches and stone buildings and whatnot. Then we see more medieval structures in Eco. Then we see much more advanced technology in The Last Guardian. And then we see just full-on robot mechs. Something you could see out of Neon Genesis Evangelion. That is my primary piece of evidence to back that timeline up. Now, given the nature of these games, how they're meant to stand out individually, it's highly unlikely that Fumito Ueda is ever going to overtly confirm which game is in what kind of chronology. All of these games were made to stand out in their own right. Yet, he chooses to put them in a shared universe for thematic reasons. What are your speculations on the Team Eco timeline? Let me know down below. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on this. Perhaps there's something I've overlooked, or perhaps there's a better piece of evidence that you can back up with your case. I'd be very curious to hear. But in the meantime, ScotsThinker signing out.